Morning, Grayton. Our topic for today is going to be classification of living things. Okay, so we would have started this topic inside class, so this is going to be a continuation. But like we said inside class, the purpose of classification is to group the millions of different organisms that we have on this planet into groups based on their similarities. Okay. Also, during classification, animals are going to be described and they are going to be placed into groups based on their similarities. They're also going to be given a name. Okay, so the science that deals with this is called taxonomy. And in taxonomy, there are about 7 different levels of classification. Well, there's 8 if you include domain. And as you go through those different levels, the group gets smaller and smaller. So the biggest levels are going to be the levels at the top, such as domain and kingdoms. And as you move further along the classification levels, it gets smaller and smaller until you get to one organism. Okay, so here's an example of the 7 different levels of classification being used. Okay, so we are describing 3 different organisms: a cat, a wolf, and a fly. They're all a part of the animal kingdom. Once we get down to the phylum, they're going to have different phylums. The cat and the wolf, they're both considered chordata, which is another way of saying vertebrate, which means, an animal with a backbone. The fly on our hand is going to be called Arthropoda, okay? And as you move down the classes, because a cat and a wolf, they share a lot of the same similarities. The first levels, the first 4 levels are basically identical, okay? But as you move past uh, this 4th level here, the family, that's when you see there's going to be a difference in the families that they're in. There's also a difference in the genus they're in. And obviously, when it comes to the species, there's always going to be a difference in species when you're comparing different organisms. Okay? So that is how the 7 levels of classification are used. Okay? Initially, you start off, with the broadest level of classification, which is going to be the animal kingdom. All 3 of these organisms had that in common. They were all animals. Once you got to phylum, only the cat and the wolf were chordata, or only them were still vertebrates. The fly is a part of the arthropoda. The cat and the wolf, they're both mammals, so they had the same class. The fly is an insect. Uh, Cat and wolf, once again, they are part of the carnivora order, okay, which means that they are carnivores. The fly had a different order. And like I said earlier, once they got to the family, each of these different organisms, they had different families. And then as they move further down these levels of classification, they were placed into different groups. So at that point, they no longer had anything in common. Okay, so with the cat, they're part of the family Felidae, and the wolf is a part of the family Canidae. Okay, so Felidae, that basically comes from the word felines, because we usually refer to, you know, animals that are part of the feline family as felines. Okay, so whether it's a lion, a cat, uh, a leopard, we all say they are part of the feline family, which is why this family is called Felidae. All right, moving on. So, what is classification? As we said earlier, this is the process of distributing living things into groups based on their shared similarities. The same way how we were, just doing that here inside this example here. For example, the class, both the cat and the wolf were mammals because we know mammals have a certain amount of shared traits. For example, they may have fur, they give birth to live young, they nurse their young. So those are a few examples of, some of the characteristics that mammals share. Okay, and the science that deals with focusing on, classifying different living things and describing them and putting them into groups, that is called taxonomy. Okay, taxonomy basically describes every organism and it places them into groups and it also gives them a scientific name. And as I said earlier, there are millions of different organisms on this planet. So that is a lot of different, organisms that you have to give a name to. So this is why we have 7 different levels of classification, or 8 if you include the domain, which we would have talked about inside class earlier this week. Okay, so as shown earlier, the largest level is called the kingdom. And this level is going to have a broad variety of organisms sharing a specific trait. If we were to go back to the same example here, the kingdom we talked about was the animal kingdom. Okay, so this was the broadest level of classification shown here. And all 3 of these organisms were all animals. Okay, so even though a cat, wolf, and fly are all different from one another, they still shared but those similar traits to both be called an animal. And the smallest level of classification is called the species. Okay, so when it comes to the species, only one type of organism is going to be given the same species name. Okay, so there are going to be no different organisms that share a similar species names. The species name only refers to one organism. Okay, and as we move on, we'll talk about scientific names and how each organism is given 2 scientific names that is unique to them only to make sure that none of these organisms are confused with one another. Okay, so here's an example of the 7 levels of classification being used. Okay, so when you look at this picture here, you have a few animals. You have a bear, you have 2 bears, you have a panda, which is also a bear, you have a fox, a squirrel, you have a sea star, and you have a snake. All of these animals are in the same kingdom called the animal kingdom, because like we said, they are animals. An animal is a multicellular organism that gets its food from another organism, okay? Or a multicellular organism that has to eat something else to get its food. So that is a good description of animals. So if someone has all of those traits, meaning they're multicellular and they get the food from another animal, they're going to be called, or they're going to be a part of the animal kingdom. Okay, next you have the phylum Chordata, which I said earlier means that they are vertebrates. All of these animals here have backbones. Okay, and as you continue to move along or move down these 7 levels of classification, you see slowly, it refers to a smaller and smaller group of organisms until you get down to the species, which is only referring to one or a specific organism. Okay, so when we move down to the mammals, the snake is no longer there. Okay, because the snake is a reptile. It's not a part of the mammal class. When you move down again to carnivora, meaning a carnivore or an animal that eats meat, the squirrel is no longer here because squirrels are herbivores. Okay, they eat plants and or anything that comes from a plant, such as fruits or nuts. Okay, and then once again, you move down to the family, and all of a sudden, the fox isn't there anymore. Like I said, all of these animals here, the bear, the grizzly bear, the black bear, the grizzly bear, and the panda, they are all a part of the same families. Okay, they are all considered bears. Okay, you move down again. Now you're down to two organisms when it comes to the genus. So that means that the grizzly bear and the black bear, they're going to have more in common, compared to the panda. Okay, and then finally move down to the species. Okay, so the species refers to only one organism. Okay, and like I said earlier, with the species, they are given two scientific names, and organisms who are part of the same species have the ability to reproduce with one another. Okay, so a grizzly bear can only reproduce with another grizzly bear and produce an offspring that is fertile, or an offspring who has that ability to also reproduce. So there's an example of these 7 levels of classification being used. You start off with a broad group such as the kingdom. All of these, such as the animal kingdom, all of those animals had a similar, amount of traits. And as you move further down, the group got smaller and smaller until you reach the species where it's only referring to one organism. Okay, so the person who is responsible for creating this system or creating taxonomy is Carl Linnaeus. Okay, so he came up with this, this seven levels of classification, and he was also responsible for naming over 4,000 animals and 7,000 plants. Okay, so he basically gave a scientific name to, all these different organisms, and he created the kingdoms, the class, orders, the genus. He came up with this way of classifying these organisms. Okay, so the system he created is called the binomial nomenclature system. Okay, so this is a system that he uses to classify these different organisms into groups. Okay, so when it comes to giving these organisms a scientific name, like I said earlier, each organism is given two Latin names to refer to them. Okay, okay, and this is what we would refer to as the scientific name of that organism. Okay, so the first name of the organism is going to come from their genus, and the second name is going to come from their species. All right, so going back to this example here, when we was talking about the grizzly bear, you can see it has two names. This first name here came from its genus. The second name comes from its species. Okay, there's also a certain way that you write this. The genus, the first letter of the genus always has to be capitalized. Okay, and either its scientific name will be underlined or it would be italicized. So here's an example of that. For example, for humans, we are said to be a part of the genus Homo, and our species is going to be sapiens. So when we talk about our scientific name, it's going to be Homo sapiens. And like I said, either you have to underline it if you're not italicizing it, or you're going to have to write it in italics, which means it's just basically going to be a little slanted. Okay, so this is the correct way of writing the scientific name of an organism. So here are some examples of scientific names. Okay. Usually when we look at an animal or a plant or any living thing, we usually refer to them by their common names. Okay. But when you're trying to name millions and millions of different organisms, the reason why you can't continue to use a common name is because eventually you're going to start confusing things. Okay. So we might call uh, a bluebird over here a jay, and then in some other country, maybe they have another name for a blue for a bird that they call jay. Maybe a bird in another country that they call jay would be black. Okay, so this is why we can't use common names because people might use the same name to refer to different animals around the world. Okay, so when we use a scientific name, on the other hand, we're giving each of these organisms two names, and this name is unique to them. Okay, so it's only referring to one organism, and that makes sure that we're not confusing organisms with one another. Okay, so for example, the common name for this animal here is a lion, but the scientific name can be seen here down below, Panthera leo. Same thing with a dog. That's the common name. And here's the scientific name. Dolphin. Same thing. The common name is dolphin, but here's the scientific name. Okay, because you may have different, varieties of a dolphin. But if you want to refer specifically to one type of dolphin, you're gonna have to use the scientific name to distinguish them from one another. And here's the scientific name of a butterfly. Okay, so here are some questions that I'll be posting to Google Classrooms for you guys to answer.